Thank you for joining us at NJBIC conference and our discussion on the Civilian Service, Civilian Review Board. I'm Assemblywoman Shavonda Sumter. Joining me today, I have Assemblywoman Verlena Reynolds Jackson and none other than Mr. George Gore. We're going to have an exciting discussion on why we need a Civilian Review Board in the state. I'm going to start with just a little history. The bill number is A4656, sponsored by Assemblywoman McKnight. In August of 2020, the Supreme Court of New Jersey struck down key parts of Newark's 2016 ordinance and ruled that the Civilian Review Board cannot be granted subpoena power in conducting its own investigations. This was a critical piece for the citizens to feel empowered. Additionally, it required us to take legislative action. So we're here today with Assemblywoman Reynolds Jackson, pitch hitting for Assemblywoman McKnight, who had an emergency, to tell us about the need for the CCRB and why it's important for communities of color. I'm going to have Assemblywoman Reynolds Jackson introduce herself, and then we'll punt to Mr. George Gore to introduce themselves, and then we'll dive deep into this conversation. Assemblywoman Reynolds Jackson.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me today. And it's an honor to fill in a gap for Assemblywoman Angela McKnight as she tends to some other things. I am from the 15th Legislative District. Human rights, civil rights, activism, speaking up for Black people is one of my passions. This is what we do as a people. And so I thought it was a great idea. It's not like we haven't heard of civilian review boards before. They're called oversight committees in other parts of the country. They have them and they can be very, very effective. I think when we look at the callousness of Chauvin and how he murdered George Floyd, we have to think about the culture in which this individual, who was a leader in his organization, and how do we combat that type of behavior? He was an instructor. And so I think when we look at organizations in law enforcement and how they're trained, the review board gives power to the community to say they're only get cases or applicants or investigations upon a complaint. If your department is doing its due diligence and they're treating civilians with respect, then this shouldn't affect you. But I think the concern is around if there is a question mark about the culture within your department. And so how do we look at those bad apples, those bad practices that happen? And so in any other organization, you have all types of reviews, you have all types of boards and committees, ethics committees that go through this. I think because law enforcement is one of those that have a deadly force where they are able to carry a lethal weapon, it puts them at a higher level of protection. And we want to make sure that they're using that same higher level for the civilians and the people that are in the community. So I think it's important that we have this conversation. And I think it's important that we continue to educate the community about why it's important on both sides, whether you agree or disagree, is one that's bringing us together collectively to talk about the bad culture within some police departments.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Mr. George Gore.
How are you? My name is George Gore. I'm a chaplain actually for the state police. I've been working with the Civilian Complaint Review Boards as we started this process in Newark, and it was called NCAP, okay, which was for oversight and recommendations. And we worked with a lot of organizations like the ACLU, the Assembly people. Ron Rice was on the committee with us. Jerry Harris at that time was at the Institute of Social Justice. We had people from BIC, we had NAACP, the National Action Network. And we sit down and we crafted a document that was called NCAP, okay, and that was for Newark specifically. and we talked about what we needed and the things that they were going to have. In some of the other cities, you have something similar to MCAP. And actually what they've done is they've used the Human Relations Commission to serve as that same document. For example, in Plainfield, we have a Human Relations Commission. And if you have a complaint, there's a form that you can go down to City Hall and get and fill out the form. The form comes directly to Human Relations Commission. The Human Relations Commission does investigations and things, and we call in the required people, and we've had fairly good cooperation from the city and from the police to do those kinds of things. And these kinds of organizations kind of sort of exist in other cities, although Newark has probably the most formalized considered the review board. And we all knew when we did it that the police department was not going to go along with the subpoena power. Because that put them on a different level, and that put them on actually being required to give information under oath. And so that was one of the problems that they were having with that whole piece. So we can talk about that as we go along. Actually, this goes all the way back to 2014. It's when we actually wrote the actual original document for Newark. We worked with City Council, we worked with the mayor, to craft this document and got sign off from everybody, including City Council.
So thank you for that historical reference. For those watching, a civilian review board oversight mechanism, that's what we're talking about for victims of police misconduct. These may rise to a complaint where you're seeking redress, and a civilian review board consists of civilians rather than sworn police officers. It's an external means of a checks and balances where communities are empowered. So I just wanted to put that definition out there. Additionally, civilian review boards have been around for over 100 years in the United States. You've heard both of our panelists share that other communities have them in different names and different forms. Things came to a boiling point. We talked about the civil unrest of 2020 with the Derek Chauvin case and the senseless killing of George Floyd, of Mr. George Floyd. We also talked about New Jersey's history in 2014, where Mr. Gore shared that they were working on this very same policy to empower its residents. So one of the sticking points is a big term, subpoena power. The ability to have subpoena power. Why is that important? And I'll start with you, Assemblywoman Reynolds Jackson, if you can share with us the importance of having subpoena power by civilians.
I think the important part here is that they're able to come in if you just have a board without subpoena power, there's no accountability. And so then you just have a committee and there's no enforcement. But I think as you have the board formed, to have the subpoena power to call in the people that you need to talk to hear, to gather information is critical. Otherwise, you know, it's a ad hoc that without power. And so I think the courts did an excellent job at pointing that out. And that's why we're fighting for this, because we know the power that comes behind that to compel them to come in and to provide information, to provide truthful information. And so these are the type of things that we need to make this board successful. And then the people that go on the board, you know, it's not, you know, we're looking for people to serve on these boards that have some type of information or a skill set. Where, you know, I think that's important as well. But definitely the ability to ask them to come in, to give testimony is powerful. And without it, it just becomes another tool, but not a sharp knife.
There we go. Thank you for that, Mr. Gore.
Yeah, one of the nice parts about that is it creates a document that has history that can be gone back and reviewed. It creates information about what happened, when it happened, how it happened, to who it happened. And it creates a chain that cannot be broken in terms of somebody saying, oh, that's not what happened. The documentation itself becomes important, because if ever it becomes a court case, okay, then you need documentation to say it was looked at. And the citizens get the opportunity to look at those things and create those documents and make sure that the people who are responsible for doing those things are now on point and are doing what they're supposed to do as a police department. One of the things that look at the review board and the complaints, and one of the things that we always refer to the police department, we kind of missed one small part. There are as many problems with the fire department and how they respond and how they don't respond to certain places and certain areas and certain things. And one of the things we included in our document originally was that we would look at other departments that affect the community and affect the community in a different way. And people say fire department. Yeah, because if I'm on west side of Newark and it takes an hour for them to get there, and I'm on the other side of Newark, south side of Newark, and it takes 15 minutes, then that's a problem. And somebody needs to be talking about that. And you have to ask yourself, what kind of forum would you talk to about it? And that was one of the things that's kind of in the review board, that it does not just allow itself only to deal with police, but also things that are health and body problems that happen within a city.
And thank you for that, because when we talk about the violence as a public health crisis and trauma as a public health crisis as well. So when we look at trying to move this civilian complaint review board, and we've been talking about this since the beginning of the year, I give Assemblywoman McKnight credit because she's met with PBAs, police, she's met with municipal leaders, she's met with grassroots organizations around this issue to not only follow an edict determined by the state Supreme Court, but also to know what the people's needs are. So I'd like for you both to share a little bit with us because you both come from strong grassroots communities, and that's what it's about that propels us forward, to talk about the value of grassroots organizations and helping the Civilian Complaint Review Board come into the light.
If you don't mind, I'd just like to jump in. I love having the community involved. Assemblywoman McKnight came to the city of Trenton, and our grassroots organizers were very excited about coming out to hear about this bill and other bills that we're looking to do in terms of police reform and communities coming together. You know, it's not like we make these things up. You know, we're not shaking a ball. We're not, imagining why we need this civilian review board. We have the data. And I think when we start to look at some of the legislation that has been passed, that's gotten signed into law, it's all because of the community. The governor signed into law that for officers to wear body cameras. That was specifically out of some of the instances that happened here in New Jersey. Another bill that came out, it was that he signed, requires attorney generals to report some crimes in prosecutor data. That came out of, this is all information that have coming out of civilians and communities coming together saying, we want to know. We had a paper trail before, but now this is all electronic. So we get to see real data in time. If you had to use your firearm, if there was a complaint filed, these things are all in a database that can be pulled up to see. Is there something going on, as we said earlier, in the culture that we need to be taking a look at, and what types of things are coming up? So another one was includes false police reports as a bias intimidation. The governor signed these things into law. Minority recruitment for law enforcement. We don't have enough of us, in leadership roles to be able to say, no, we're going to be a part of this new culture that we're having coming out. There's also mandatory diversity and implicit bias training. Again, because there are different cultures that have different things. Police and law enforcement need to be aware of it. And the governor recognizes this and signed this into law. We talk about our youth. Ages for mitigating factors in sentencing. That's another big one that the governor signed into law as well. this is just a few samples just to say, we know that we're on the right path here when we have so much conversation, I'm gonna say it in a nice way, about the Civilian Review Board, but we know that it's worth it because we want to be able to have those things in place. And when you look at the long history, the longevity that we've been asking about this, it's time. We just have to have the wherewithal to stay the course, to organize and keep on demanding that we get this Civilian Review Board passed. And so that we can begin to create them throughout the state. So I'm sorry to jump in, but I just had to get that out.
And get it out, you did. These are all companion pieces of legislation and pillars in making sure we combat the systemic and structural racism inherent within the systems. And we give civilians some power. That's what this is really about. Mr. Gore, you've been working with community organizations since I've known you, and probably, it definitely predates me, as we had some talks before we started this session right here. So please, let's share with folks how they can be empowered and the importance of grassroots organization in this battle.
Well, let's just talk about Newark specific, and I'll talk about we did an investigation in Newark. And there were 1,600 complaints that were filed, I think in 2014. Only one of them was investigated. And that was kind of like, oops. So when they asked why was there all these complaints filed with the police department, and why was there no investigation, we got no answer. And so that was like, okay, then we know we have a problem. And so we talked with the mayor, president, city council at that time, started talking about, okay, how do we ensure that when a citizen files a complaint, that the complaint is actually followed on, and that there's actually some follow-up and there's actually some discussion? And so when we wanted to look at the files, and you all know the answer to that one, we didn't get them, but we did get the number, which was 1,601 investigation. What happens in most cities, citizens don't know how to file. They don't know who to go to. They don't know how to document the fact that they actually file. The documentation is what becomes critical, because if you can't find a piece of paper that says I actually showed up here and I gave you information, then you can't say that the police department didn't do what they're supposed to do. You've got to have an audit trail. And so one of the things that the Civilian Complete Review Board was doing, and critical, was to create an audit trail. To say, here's what happens, okay? Look at the powers that the board has actually been given. To look at the improper use of force and excessive force, to look at abuse of authority by different agencies such as the police department. And the number one thing that's in here that nobody pays attention to is the disrespect that you get from somebody, okay, that is supposed to be part of your community, helping your community, when those kinds of things happen. And it's a question of getting the community to cooperate, but you can't get the community to cooperate when the people who are in the community who are supposed to help you are the ones being the most disrespectful part of that issue. So, and then other things that we looked at was sexual orientation. Okay, that became a real issue when you looked at the amount of problems they were having in Newark with people with different sexual orientations, which we found a whole bunch of them, and like everybody would like acted like surprised, and I'm like, I don't know what street you've been on, but I'm telling you, it's not unusual, okay, that you have those kinds of things. So we went to the drawing board. We sat down with people from different agencies, different groups, and said, okay, let's create a document that says what it is we really want to do. And then let's create a document that we can bring civilians in, okay, who are not part of the police department, not part of other agencies, so that those people can say, okay, let's take an objective view of what's real and what's not real, and to see that there's follow through on the other side of that. And what that also will help create is the respect that you get, because one of the things we don't have in a lot of cities is a lot of minority-based people, okay, who are actual members of the police department. And it's real difficult to have somebody come out and investigate somebody in their neighborhood where they don't look like anybody in their neighborhood. And so it makes people uncomfortable. And they need to be, and they are, as written, independent of the police department. They're not part of the police department. They don't report to anybody. They report only to the citizens and to the people who are there. And the other part of that is that there are things in here which will keep my wonderful friends in the media from going ballistic, okay, and putting out things that aren't necessarily true or should not be out at the time we're investigating something. Because it makes people uncomfortable with wanting to give you a complaint and give you something, because the last thing they need is for a name picture to be plastered all over the media, because that makes it unsafe for them. So that's one of the things, if we look in the document, it's actually in the document that this information is confidential. Okay. And so we don't do those kinds of things to protect the people from things that could make them not want to be part of this. Then you have a problem.
Very true. A couple of facts I'd like to highlight. First, that if a complaint, an active complaint, and we have a civilian review board is happening, it will remain confidential. Second, the civilian review board will not respond concurrently with an active investigation. So if there's an active investigation, then the civilian review board will have a time delay so that all of the persons who need to respond to the active investigation that is formal will have that opportunity to do so. And then the civilian complaint review board will engage, but we need them to have subpoena power so that they have the same courtesy for people to show up and report and respond to them. 3, a civilian complaint review board is permissive for a municipality or a county. If the municipality has less than 2,500 inhabitants, they can form a joint civilian review board with a neighboring town or with the county. We really wanted to give every opportunity for a community to be empowered and for citizens to be empowered to have timely responses to complaints of their local law enforcement. And a last point I want to make on the formal side right now, because we're moving fast through this topic, believe it or not, is that if deadly force was used, a civilian complaint review board is not engaged for that purpose. If deadly force was used, that's going through the official complaint channels through the Attorney General's office, and that's the dashboard and reporting that Assemblywoman Reynolds Jackson had mentioned earlier that we're now doing here in the state of New Jersey. So there are a lot of layers to this, but important ones to be sure that, one, we're not disrupting an active investigation where someone has a loss of life. So if you don't mind at this time, I'd love for you both to share how the sticking points. And Assemblywoman Reynolds Jackson, you sat through hearings where we've heard testimony from citizens on the need to be empowered with the Civilian Complaint Review Board. You've also heard from law enforcement the reasons why this would create another layer and another challenge for them with all of the additional remedies that we put in place for law enforcement to comply with. So if you can just provide some insight to diffuse some of those tensions for us.
You know, this is where I think Assemblywoman McKnight has just done an excellent job at reaching out and having these conversations. You know, I've also reached out. I've spoken with the president, Giles Shipp, over from Noble for the Black Law Enforcement Association. I think they provided, and for me, a lot of information about why they think it's important. And they were the first persons that told me about the oversight committees that are established already throughout the country. And so when we talk about trusted voices and, you know, trying to be able to understand what this legislation is going to mean, it means that you have to talk to all sides. And I have to say, George, this is the first time that I heard about the fire department as well. I hadn't even thought about that. So focused on law enforcement. that never even came across my mind. But it's in these conversations. And so I think because we've understand that there are some pieces to the review board that they should not handle. So we've made those exceptions. And this is where I say, you know, great leadership understands and recognizes there's a space for some and there's a space for others. And so she's done that. She's been able to go in and take out those sections that, you know, aren't compatible for a civilian review board. And so, you know, again, it's about getting the information out. It's about talking with your local police department, with your law enforcement. What I like when we were talking about the community piece, we still have law enforcement that goes out to our community meetings and they talk with us. Residents can come in to either uplift the issue, or the police are coming in and saying, listen, this is some issues that we've handled and this is what we should do moving forward. I think that's the goal, to have that type of community policing is where we like to be. And so this talking with your police department about the civilian review board, what are the pros and what are the cons that they would like to see in it, only helps us to be able to get to a place where we can get this passed into law with the appropriations, because this board is going to require resources in order to have attorneys, in order to do the research, in order to do the investigations, in order to have subpoena power. All of these things require resources. And so I think the sponsor of this bill has done an amazing job and really has laid out a great blueprint for us to go back and continue conversations in our community, why it's important for us to have. So thank you for having me here today, Assemblywoman Sumter.
And thank you for that. George, please.
What's interesting about the whole thing is that it's really been done and thought about for a long period of time. It's not new. The last attorney general we had brought in his use of force and talked about how things, and I thought it was a great thing when finally that local people weren't going to investigate shootings, that we're going to go up to the attorney general. I think that helped a lot. But the other parts of that, you get into the investigation and what the investigation includes and what fact finding includes. The other thing is that part of that process is a policy auditing, okay, to look at what the policy actually is in the police department. The other part that I see was incorporated, hopefully, is the training, because you can't expect that the regular citizen walking in thoroughly understands what a police department does, what it doesn't do, what it's not supposed to do, unless you make sure there's a training component in there to tell them what it is that the police department is responsible for and isn't responsible for. And we sometimes miss the training component because there are people come in there and that have a misunderstanding of what their role is. And I think if they're going to be on there, then we need to make sure that they understand what the board is, what it does, how it works, and the fact that we provide them training. And I know that the Attorney General's office has been really good at providing things to people. And I know even Newark, because I've sat through a couple of meetings with the people in Newark and the police department, where they actually went out in the community and explained to the community what response time was, what they were expected to do. Because if you don't understand, then it'll make you make a different judgment based on what things are. But oversight is absolutely needed, because for too long we haven't had oversight. For too long, people have just done what they wanted to do. I think now you're starting to see police departments being more cooperative with the local community. I think you'll find that if we ourselves stand up and be counted, then you're going to find that they're going to have to stand up and be counted with us. So it's a complicated document, okay? It's a complicated law, but I think it's a law that's well overdue. And I think that we need to make sure we're protecting not only ourselves and our community and how we're policed, but we're also protecting the police officers who are policing us at the same time.
Well stated, Mr. Gore. And to your point, this bill also calls for training because Assemblywoman McKnight heard that as well. Too, for the mayors, the urban mayors weighed in and wanted to have a selection process with their municipal council leaders. If it's a municipal board, that is also in this bill. Additionally, we have included where they can request via motion the case files from an internal affairs investigation that has been started. So we really worked with Assemblywoman McKnight, and I say we because I've been with her through this whole journey, have taken great pains to hear the courts, to hear from the Attorney General, to hear from law enforcement, to hear from our advocates, to be sure that all voices are heard, and we have a working committee and not a body that becomes frustrated and immobilized. We really want them to have value for the community, and this bill does that. By way of housekeeping, we're nearing the end of the term for this legislative session. We're nearing the end of the term for this legislative session. If this bill, this legislation A4656 does not pass in the Assembly and in the Senate, we cannot get it to the governor's desk to be signed. And then we have to start all over again in the new session, which starts in January. As we mentioned, it takes 41 members, I may not have mentioned it on this session, but on a previous session, to pass in the Assembly and 21 in the Senate. So it's important that we get to those votes. So we're asking our viewers to reach out to their legislators in the New Jersey General Assembly and the Senate to support this legislation. It's also silly season known as campaign season, but I'm excited to say that it's voting season. It's voting season. So we need folks to talk to people about bills such as this, because it's a systemic and structural change that we need. So I'm on a soapbox now where we really need people to support us in moving these bills. Talk to Speaker Coughlin, talk to Senate President Steve Sweeney, talk to Governor Phil Murphy when you see them, and tell them that this bill is important for all communities, not just Black and brown communities, for all communities to feel empowered, to make sure that protocols and training is being followed and over enforcements are not happening. And we have data to support otherwise. So it's important that we all lean in for this purpose. I'd also like to ask that NJBIC continue to work with the New Jersey General Assembly and the legislature to elevate these type of policy changes so that we can inform our communities across the state on the work that we're doing as a legislative Black caucus and a full body to support the change that we need to see. Mr. Gore mentioned that he worked on this 2014, 2016. Assemblywoman Reynolds Jackson and I have been working on this during our tenure with Assemblywoman McKnight, but we know for over 100 years, different communities have had these type of boards. So we're just trying to have our communities have that same power. At this time, I'm gonna open it up for you both to share with our viewers closing remarks and comments and feedback, and how they can stay engaged to make sure that we continue to alert them on critical policies such as the Civilian Complaint Review Board.
Well, I want to thank NJBIC for allowing us to come and have this platform. One of the great things I think happened out of COVID was this virtual conference that we're able to have, and to be able to uplift these type of conversations and reach people throughout the country, right? It's not just in New Jersey, but we're able to share this, people come on. And so Assemblywoman, you brought up a great point in making sure that, you know, when we're out there, we're in the community and we're talking, we need 50% plus one. So you know you have two great legislators on this call, so you can subtract that. But you also have to reach out to the other legislators that aren't on this call. And don't assume that everybody is in support of. Until you ask the question, you know, you don't know where they are. And so, you know, if you get a yes, then you move on to the next one. But we have 80 on one side and 40 on another side. So you got to get through them all. And it's important that you reach out to them. So this is the busy work, the hard work that gets bills over the line. The body camera bill took another 20 plus years to get across. This Civilian Review Board and the climate that we're talking about now, Black Lives Matter, it should get done in this session. So those are my closing remarks. And I thank you so much for creating this space for us to talk about reparations in one form or another.
Okay. One of the things that the Plainfield's called the Human Relations Commission, it actually was created in 1968, right after the riots. Okay, and somebody said, okay, We need to sit down and talk about how we do things. So they actually created a document that's very similar to the NCAP document. Like I said, back in 1968, and we all kind of forget there was a riot during those kinds of times, and that riot caused the creation of these kinds of bills and these kinds of groups to put together and sit down and talk with different cities. The problem is we got more comfortable with what we are. Things got out of hand. Now we're trying to bring it back into the corral. That's a real difficult process, but we need to do that. The most important thing we need to do this year, vote. We don't do anything else this year. We need to vote. Okay. You need to really realize that the power of your vote is a power of influence on how things will happen inside of your city, inside of your legislative districts. And if people know that you're going to go to the polls, then they're a little more careful about how they do things and how they alter or change policy or fail to implement policy. This goes back, and the riot was 68. I wasn't here. I was in Detroit. They were doing the same thing. However, it created a bunch of these organizations. And what has happened is that citizens have not necessarily engaged with them. But I'll leave you with this last thought. It's time to vote.
Thank you both for taking time to share on this panel. And thank you for reminding us it is time to vote. Let's exercise that right. November 2nd is the election in the state of New Jersey. However, vote by mail ballots will be starting in the next couple of days. We have early voting. Thank you to the fabulous legislator right there, wink, wink, Assemblywoman Verlena Reynolds-Jackson, who worked with us on that. And thank you all for tuning in. Please remember to reach out to your legislators. You have two of us here. Assemblywoman McKnight is sorry that she couldn't join us, but we are standing in her stead and elevating the work of the people for each of us and for future generations. Thank you for having us, NJ Big. Stay safe. God bless everyone.